electricity generated from electricity generated from solar can be equal to in price to electricity generated by fossil fuels, and then you've reached what they call like grid parity.
Mm-hmm.
Parity. Yeah, parity. And they I was just spelling that out for myself. No, not a parody.
It's not a parody.
Yeah, but they yeah. So you have that, and then but yeah, the problem with renewables is that well, I guess one, just that they cost more upfront. So if you require everybody to pay for them upfront, and you don't offset it with serious taxation of the rich, then you're raising the cost of electricity for everybody.
How do you?
And probably you're gonna, so that's one issue. But I have some more I can talk about though. But we can address these one at a time.
Yeah. I have. There was an interesting statement there that I want to like poke you on. So, how do you feel about serious taxation for the rich?
Like progressive taxation.
Like let's use Elizabeth Warren's plan, right? Which I think is like 2 cents after. In the debate, she said 50 billion, but I haven't checked if like she meant 50 million.
Yeah, I think she meant 50 million too. I think.
Yeah. So what do you think about that type of taxation for the rich?
I don't like the wealth tax because that it seems like there would be a lot of weird consequences to that. Firstly, my issue is I don't like the idea of having to give up property you've already got rather than giving up income that is coming in, just because that's I think a newer form, a less established form of taxation that to me seems just much more onerous than paying more money out of your income. So that's one thing. And then arguably the items being taxed, maybe not arguably, I think this is true. The wealth that's being taxed was already taxed once when you accumulated it, right? Or if it's a piece of property, I guess in terms of like your property taxes, or if it's a stock, like when you gosh, I guess I don't know about I don't know as much as I should about taxation of stock transactions, but assuming there's some tax there, then if you're paying a wealth tax on the amount of stock you own, since this is 50 million of assets, right? This is not like 50 million of income; it's 50 million of assets. So just like most of the assets you accumulate, there was some tax on up front.
So you're not okay with like having another tax on top of that?
No, I don't really like that. I think a good tax system avoids double taxation.
How come? It might sound like obvious, but I'm still asking.
It would be ideal if, no, these are good questions. It would be ideal if you know the tax consequences of a transaction up front. So if you are going to buy something, then like, I don't know if you've got sales tax wherever you're at, but sales tax of, say, 7% on a good, right? Okay, I know that this dollar item is going to be $1.07, right? And I know that's kind of a flimsy example when you're talking about a wealth tax, but at a high level, I guess at that point, maybe you're doing things like buying companies, and if like the value of your company shoots up beyond 50 million, then does that mean you have to liquidate a piece of your company in order to sell it in order to pay your 2% wealth tax? I don't know. Maybe you have enough cash on hand to handle it. I don't know. But that seems like a strange way to handle it rather than just saying, okay, you make this much income from wages or this much income from capital gains. We want to tax the rich more, so we will just tax your income more. We will raise your capital gains tax, or we will raise your whatever income taxes are.
I'm kind of ignorant about this in general, because I was under the impression, like when she was like talking about her plan, that would be like 2 cents out of what you make, right? So or out of your full gainage or whatever, I guess. So if you have like 50 million, you don't get taxed, but then once you start getting 51 million, 52 million, like every dollar's taxed to 2 cents.
Yeah, and so I guess I just I have to think about how it would work in practice to provide some more coherent examples, but I think it seems to me like, apart from the objections I had to it, just from the sense of I would rather be taxed on income, I'd rather be taxed on liquid assets that I can just immediately give to you, rather than be taxed on fixed assets that I would have to turn into liquid cash. Yeah. Because that's what I think a wealth tax would do. So, and I think arguably that's one of the points of it that isn't really talked about much, but I think that's one of the points is if you have all these assets, we want you to sell them, maybe even sell them. Like if you were if you were one of these billionaires and you're hit with the wealth tax, then the first year, even though it's only 2%, I don't know that somebody like Jeff Bezos, for example, has 2% of their wealth in cash at all. It's like the amount of cash he has on hand is probably super small. I'm just guessing here, but it's probably not like $2 billion of cash just hanging out in a bank. So I think he'd have to sell some of what he's got to turn it into cash to pay his wealth tax. Now, the implications of that and the way that it would work, it seems like there would be a lot of compelled sales there, in order to pay your wealth tax. And that seems really strange to me, And then some people are saying the estate tax is subject to all the same arguments as any wealth tax. Your position is against the estate tax equally and therefore ridiculous. I'm open to striking the estate tax if that's the issue here. I mean, because again, that money was also already taxed. So yeah, I mean, if that's the issue.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm just generally confused. So I guess I'm confused on like where you'd want the taxation to come from. So when you believe like in taxes, you believe that it should only be like, I guess, like towards businesses these people own and not into their income.
Well, it would be ideal if what you were taxing was just coming out of, the cash that you're bringing in. And I mean, the one example I can think of where what I'm saying breaks down a little bit is property taxes. But I mean, other than property taxes, which I guess are just a super well-established way of funding things that, funding, local governments, I don't know, like, other forms of wealth taxation just seem really, oh man, somebody's dropping land value taxation in the chat. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's something to that, but that's different from, I think, a wealth tax. So,
okay.
But yeah, that to me seems like a big problem. Is you'd have to convert a lot of your assets into cash just to pay the wealth tax. And that, I don't know, I'd rather just tax the income that they get every year because these assets generate income. So why don't you just if you want to take more from the rich, why don't you just take more from it, more of it from there.
You should make a list of like the taxes you're for and against and like put it on your Discord and stuff so people like can keep track and stuff, because like I'm just like wondering in my head, like couldn't you make an argument that like this will sound like really wonky or whatever, I don't want to say like loopholes, but technically like legal loopholes or whatever, right? Where they can and I forgot where I read this, and I forgot the specifics, so my sentence might make no sense. I'm just warning you now. I'm not an idiot. I'm just.
I like, for example, just to give you some context, I really don't know anything about property taxes because I don't work on those like in the course of my everyday work. I work on some of the other taxes we're talking about, but. So I really don't know much about property taxes. So we're both learning here.
Yeah, because like what I was thinking is that if somebody had right, if we're just doing this off of income, right, like, I make $1 million a year or whatever, and I don't want to pay taxes on that, I'm thinking that I would, like, I guess, try to make my income less and have the company, like, redirect that into, like, I don't know, like, let's say, like, buying back stocks or whatever, that then I would technically own because I'm the head of the company. Does this make sense? Am I, like, being clear here? So, so how do you deal with that when, like, people are doing those, like, loopholes like that? How would you get the money that way then?
Now, can you say that again?
So, let's say I make $1 million a year, right? I'm the CEO of a company, $1 million a year. Let's say I've gone public, so some people have stock. I don't want to pay my income tax. I don't want, like, them to charge my $1 million or whatever.
Right.
So I make the company pay me less. And then I, like, basically get the company to buy back more stock. That then at the end of the day, because I'm like the head of that company, wouldn't I like gain money through that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about stock buybacks because I believe they were banned until 1982. I learned today because they were banned as a kind of market manipulation. but I don't know. I don't know. I'm just not sure how I feel about that.
Because I think,
So
like, if I'm
because
a,
I mean,
yeah,
what's that?
I was thinking, yeah,
Like
if I'm a
if they're
rich
giving you a
millionaire.
form of income, then I mean, income is income. So I mean, I guess it should be, huh? Yeah, I don't know. That's something to think about, though. Kite, what were you what are you saying? What do you mean when you say the company has the same amount of money? Because now, like, are you talking about how do we tax the individual or how do we tax the company? You're talking about how do we tax the individual, right?
Are you talking to me? Or
Oh,
to
sorry,
somebody
yeah,
in
I'm
your chat?
talking to you. Yeah,
Okay.
how do you you're this is a question for how do you tax the individual?
Yeah, exactly. Because if I'm an individual, yeah, I'm talking about how
Mm-hmm.
to tax the individual. Because how are you going to make, like, yeah, how are you going to, like, tax the individual's wealth or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
if they're purposely, like, kind of, like, manipulating their wealth to seem, like, at least, like, lower than it
Mm-hmm.
what it actually is because in
Mm-hmm.
terms of stock. And I think you said
Yeah.
earlier you're not in favor
Mm-hmm.
of, like, having people, like, put taxes on stock.
Well, I mean that currently is covered by the existing capital gains tax, and I guess that form of liquidation is arguably less of an issue than saying having to liquidate all kinds of other assets. Like stocks are not much of a problem to liquidate compared to, say, I don't know, other forms of hard property that are, you have to find a willing buyer, willing seller, and all that. But it like I guess if the company uses liquid capital to repurchase stock, then the company is ultimately not changing in value. So here, the only person who is benefiting is the CEO, who is being paid for in terms of stock rather than, is being paid for in stock rather than in cash. So you just have to find a way, I guess, to tax that the same way you tax the income. And I guess I don't know that a wealth tax would achieve that goal the same way, but maybe you could figure out some other form of being taxed on income, because I think that would still be a form of income you're getting, right?
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
yeah, I was just like, I guess I was confused because I thought you were, like,
yeah.
against taxing stock and stuff.
Well, like what I'm more worried about is the prospect of, okay, so you've had this stock for a while, and then it's tax time, and because you just have it, you're getting taxed 2%. And then next year, okay, it's tax time, you still held on to it, you're getting taxed another 2%, you know, like on and on, versus one time, a transfer, a tax on like a one time transfer of an asset that I guess is given to you as a form of income, right? So,
Well, yeah, but then don't you have, like, the problem that, like, that your stock, like, can also, like, gain value and value and value and value, right? So
mm-hmm,
it's
yeah,
not the same thing as, like, oh, I'm just gaining, like, $1 here and you're taxing my
mm-hmm,
dollar once. It's that, oh,
mm-hmm,
like, this is increasing in value and going higher and higher and higher. So
mm-hmm,
taxing it
yeah.
once doesn't really make much sense because it's
Well,
increased in value, like, every year, and you're gaining
yeah,
more
but
from
like
that.
you wouldn't, I mean, I don't know that that makes it unfair, though. I mean, if you buy a good of some kind and it appreciates in value, that doesn't mean that it was like that doesn't pose a problem like intrinsically, right? But if you're saying if that good is stock, that poses a problem, right?
Well, I guess I guess the main reason why I'm saying, like, pose this, like, a problem, right, is when you
Yeah,
have people who are, like, hella rich, right, and they're, like,
yeah,
kind of, like, investing their income back into that, but in a way where it doesn't seem to be like their direct income, like what we were talking about before. Um, so yeah, so I like, yeah,
Well, the other thing is though that a stock can always like decrease in value,
yeah,
and
that's
I
a
don't know if So I mean, there's some. I mean, I guess you're still probably getting taxed again in this situation,
mm-hmm.
whether it increases and decreases in value too, right? Which I don't know. I mean, like it's stock again is an asset that, or a kind of asset that it's easy to imagine affecting monetarily. But to me, when you think about how this would work in practice, I mean, you could think about it in all kinds of ways. Like if you had an expensive car, or if you had some jewelry, or if you had some other kind of rare and valuable good, or if you were just over the 50 million mark for a variety of reasons of things you owned, like would it make sense really to tax those items just for basically existing, sitting there, versus saying up front, okay, when you buy this, you're going to pay such and such a tax on it, up front. and you know what that is in advance, and that doesn't change because now you own the good and there's no tax on it. I mean,
so out of curiosity, would you be against like buybacks then?
I'm not like, I would like to know more about them because I guess they were banned at one point, which I didn't know, but I don't intrinsically have any problem with them because when a company buys the stock back, presumably they're doing so with the consent of the shareholders, who could otherwise, I guess, vote the board out. And then, so the people who stand to gain or lose money out of this are not being affected. And then they're reinvesting the capital into the company, which the company shouldn't appreciate or shouldn't have any extra value as a result of what they're doing, I don't think. I guess you could argue maybe that it's possible that by virtue of buying the stock back, and maybe somebody in chat who knows more about this than I do could tell me, if you're buying the stock, does that push the price up in such a way that it like accelerates beyond the value of what you've invested in it? Like, is there some kind of spread you can make there? Maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but
yeah,
these are really good questions, though, Pixie.
I'm glad you think so. I'm really ignorant, so I always have questions to ask.
No, I don't think so. Although, GC, somebody in my chat just said, "Tell her you're voting for Trump 2020 and forever. I want to see her rage."
A Joker movie. Obviously, like I'm
not voting for Donald Trump.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's not, that's not a new position either. I've been pretty consistent on that.
Yeah, no. So. I just don't see. I guess I can't really fathom why you would be for him unless if you're like somebody who benefited greatly from like those multi-millionaire tax cuts, I guess.
Maybe we can try and figure that out. So the other night I used on the Big Brain podcast, I used the word nationalist, which I hope that didn't sound offensive because
I get what you like patriotism. Right. Yeah, I get what you are.
Yeah, you can use the word patriotism to mean the same thing. Mm-hmm. So if you think that the government should make decisions based on the interests of the native population of the country first. That's a word that has different meanings. But if you mean based on all the interests of the citizens of the country first, then, I guess that's like Trump's main point that he says is America first. Our administration is going to abide by the policy of supporting the interests of our citizens first before any other citizens in the world. Which, again, it seems like thin soup because that's arguably what every U.S. government has ever done. But, if that position really appeals to you, that's one reason. Right?
Yeah, but I guess, like, for me and, like, him or whatever, we have very, very different definitions of what's for the good of the nation, right? Or what appeals to the nation.
So, yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, so at least, like, from what I've seen in U.S. media and stuff like that, trying to, I guess, like, shake in the ground of our allies, right? Especially in, like, in Europe, wanting to, like, he's thrown it out multiple times, wanting to, like, take away NATO, right? Or, like, disband it or whatever.
Oh, yeah, no, I've got my NATO flag here. I'm a big fan.
Yeah. I can like understand and even agree with him to a certain extent when it comes to like specific trade deals that they have hurt like American manufacturing. However, I can also like still acknowledge that then the answer shouldn't necessarily be try to bring back like dying industries as much as it should be like reinvesting so that the younger populace or like even like mid-aged populace can go to other industries instead, not just like leaving them to like be like, you're fucked, your steel factory is closing down, like too bad for you, buddy,
Yeah.
But I guess like his vision of making like America great again, or the one he like touts and shouts. First of all, I don't think he's been doing a very good job, right? It's not like it hasn't really stopped steel or other manufacturing companies like from leaving, specifically like car manufacturers as well. it's only done is like destabilize our allies and thus give like kind of like greater power to like international threats, in my opinion, such as like China and Russia, right? And yeah, like those are just like some of the things off the top of my mind that like I don't think is like I don't want to be like what real populism is, but really his policies haven't really helped America as he states it will or has.
Well, let me ask you a question about NATO then. If you're a supporter, would you? Well, first of all, how do you feel about nuclear weapons?
Like okay, so this is a thing where it goes back to like I know it's not fair. I know, like, theoretically speaking, like, what makes America, like, so great that they should have nuclear weapons and, like, not necessarily, like, other countries. Like, that's something sometimes people tell me. But, yeah, no, I do think that nuclear weapons are, like, too much of a great threat of humanity to let, like, almost anyone have in general.
Well, okay, so no libertarian paradise where you can buy your nuclear weapons at Walmart.
No,
okay.
No. We already have mass shooters. Imagine.
Now, we have state militias in the United States. So there's say state, a National Guard for like Texas or Florida or whatever. How do you feel about like a National Guard for a state owning nuclear weapons? That's a question for somebody in the chat that just asked, or that has historically asked about that one. That was one of my first debates actually on Twitch. Was should states like U.S. states be able to have their own nuclear weapons?
You know,
that's a good one. I mean, ultimately, he put a good argument, but no, I didn't. But the reason I ask is, okay, so if you believe that do you believe that the world would be better if there were no nuclear weapons?
Ideally, they kind of, right? The world would be better without any weapons. I know that's a cop-out answer, but really goes back to, like, yeah, I think the world would be better without weapons of mass destruction, that if they get into, like, the wrong hands of a person, like, goodbye, everybody. Like, everybody's, like, kind of fucked.
Well, that's one point to think about. And then the next point to think about is, so NATO is not just, the big countries, right? Like us and Britain, and France and Germany and, and Canada. And, it's also some small countries too, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Montenegro, I think, is the newest one. And right now, all of those countries are protected by America's nuclear umbrella, which is to say that if any of those countries faces an existential threat or is hit by a nuclear blast, they are guaranteed the protection of America's nuclear weapons, and we are committed, if any of them faces a conventional threat, to go to war on their behalf in a conflict probably with Russia, probably with a country that has, I think, as many nuclear weapons as we do, maybe more, depending on how you count them. And we're obligated, in short, to go to World War III with the other biggest nuclear power in the world if Russia invades Estonia, a country that, 30 years ago was part of Russia. Do you feel like that's a good deal for Americans?
So there's a couple layers here, right? And it's a whole idea of, like, sometimes, like, this is going to be hard to explain. Sometimes, like, what's good for America, right, or what's good for, like, other countries is also is good for America, right? So I feel like there's a lot of, anti-war sentiment, especially, like almost always, right, though, that's like, why should we go to war and meddle in other countries that have no real, like, business and deal with us, right? Like, that doesn't make much sense. Why are you gonna put, like, American lives on the line? Yeah. So I think, like, although that's generally a, like, decent argument, when it comes to specific threats, like, that are, like, I would argue, like, even imperialistic threats, right, like China and Russia, which, like, once they start, like, clawing their hands into, like, one country, then it's gonna be one country, and then another, and then another, and then another, right? Because these countries aren't, like, interested in staying in their own lane, and neither has America historically, but, like, that's a separate discussion. But yeah, these countries aren't, like, interested in just, like, having their little economic power and staying in their lane and, like, being happy dandy like that. Like, they literally want, like, a majority of, like, world power, world control. And I know that sounds like very simplistic terms, but it's true, right? Like, why do you think Russia wants to, like, destabilize, like, regions across Europe and even America, right? Why do you think China, like, constantly is trying to, like, kind of, like, gain new territory or literally, like, put their authoritarian, like, foot down in the necks of anybody there who disagrees? And even companies outside of them that disagree, they still want to influence. So, yeah. I think if we're talking about, like, what's good for America and specifically the people in the United States who value, like, freedom and democracy, it's that when you have such big imperialistic nations like that, or nations that have shown to, like, want to exert that sort of force and power, trying to, like, expand across, like, potential allies, like, then we should stick up for those nations, because in the long term, those are our interests as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, that's basically the way I feel. Like, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and it turned out, actually, we have somebody in our chat right now in Latvia who says, nobody here believes the USA would actually help us if Russia tried to occupy us again. And then said, Austria, go to war with Russia to protect a small Eastern EU country? Look at Ukraine. Well, the difference is Ukraine was not in the alliance yet. There was some debate about joining, but it wasn't in the alliance. And of course, we had a deal with Ukraine where the deal was in 1993, I think, Ukraine gave up all their nuclear weapons, which they had inherited from the Soviet Union after the collapse. They gave up a bunch of nuclear weapons. In exchange, they gave them back to Russia. In exchange for an agreement between the US, the UK, and Russia that Ukraine's territorial sovereignty would be respected forever. And of course, that didn't last. And when the Russians broke that agreement, we didn't enforce it. So that is a serious, serious breach in the rules, right? But like, NATO is arguably a much stronger guarantee, right? And so, I mean, I really do think that if the Russians invaded Latvia, at least under another president, it would be World War III right away, and American troops would be there, like, as soon as possible. In fact, I think some American troops already are in the Baltic states. And I feel like that's important because those are free nations like us, and we share similar interests, and the Russians, if they attack those countries, there's no reason that they would stop there, and there's no reason that it should be excused even if they did stop there. So, I mean, there's similar nations with similar values who want to work together, and so I feel like there's real value in cooperating against a hostile, illiberal power like Russia. And so I think I like alliances like that because basically it means that, at least for defense purposes, we're in the same country. We are the same country, and that, I think, is really important since we have a lot of the same interests. Now, that guarantee has never been put to the test, really. It was invoked on 9/11, but I don't know that really is, that's not, I think Russia would have to be the entity that puts it to the test. So,
so I just have a question, right? So you're in favor of, like, protecting, like, these NATO countries and stuff like that, because in the long term, it's true, they are our interest as well, especially with those imperialistic nations like that. So don't you think we should try to weaken other imperialistic nations in general,
like China and Russia?
Yeah,
no, I'd certainly be down for that, especially considering they've already very clearly tried to do it to us. I mean, I don't know the extent to which the Chinese have interfered in our elections, but of course we know the Russians have. And it's easy to say, well, we've interfered in elections overseas too, which is true. But again, I mean, in a world of states, there's no like stateless world that exists right now you can run to. So you're basically left with having to choose between imperfect options. And you can choose to say, well, I'm above it all and it doesn't matter. Or you can say, look, the U.S. does some bad things, but certainly not as bad. Certainly a better place to live. Certainly a better, friend to have by your side than, say, Russia, given the lessons of the 20th century, or China. So it, like somebody in the chat said, do you really think Russia is a threat in 2019? And it's like, Russia was not a threat in 1919 either, but then suddenly by 1939, it was a big threat. And by 1949, they had an atomic bomb. So this changes, like, You know, they've been on their back before and have risen from it. Like, they've been in worse straits and risen to be much stronger than, you know, than before. So, like, the fact that they're relatively weak right now is no guarantee of future weakness any more than current success is a predictor of future success,
I mean,
right?
yeah, and I don't know how much I'd say they're relatively weak, because even though people do talk about like their economy not being like that big, and it's mostly like based on how do you call it, natural gas exports, like look what happened when European countries were trying to stand up for Ukraine, right? Like Russia literally threatened to like cut off their gas, right? So I think when it comes to like a nation like Russia, yes, it's true that they don't have the biggest economy and shit like that, but like they still have a very powerful resource there that as of now, until Europe, I guess, like converts to like new energy or stops relying on like Russian natural gas, like that shit's shady, you know. So I don't think it's fair to be like they're weak, I guess, because they're not completely.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different angles to that. So, like, Russia has historically been involved in the anti-fracking movement. Now, that's not to say that fracking is therefore, fracking is universally good because the Russians are against it. But it is interesting that the Russians are like, no, fracking is a terrible technology. It destroys the environment. Mother Russia would never engage in fracking. And Vladimir Putin he made a statement to this effect a couple of days ago where he said, yes, we will never frack because we care so much about the environment, which seems like more a testament to how much easily accessible oil you have than like a testament to your, you know, moral values. But it's such a like, you can think about that and just think about a country like Russia that is so dependent on the export of these resources. Like, to the extent we could someday export them to Europe by ship and have it be cheaper, like that would be a huge undercut, a huge blow to the power Russia has over these Western countries. Like, somebody in the chat, the fellow from Latvia, was saying, yeah, your country would not. They said the BBC made a war game, World War III, inside the war room, and in it, British politicians basically admit that they wouldn't confront Russia if it invaded the Baltics. And while I'm not 100% sure on that, I do think that the Western European states would probably want to sit on the fence if they could, in part because Russia provides them with all these resources that they need to stay warm in the winter and make their cars go and all that. But like, if we could replace them in that supply of energy even a little bit, then that would be a huge benefit, like, to us in terms of foreign policy. So when I said earlier, I'm not sure about ending fossil fuels overnight. Yeah, I mean, again, there's a big environmental benefit to doing that, but there are some other angles to consider that might be, in their own way, more important.
Okay. I don't think I can agree with you on that. I think I could have agreed with you, like, you know, maybe 10 years ago before we got, like, all this data about, like, oh, shit, I think, like, we're all gonna be fucked soon if we don't figure out this, like, crisis when it comes to our environment, right? But no, I can see where you're coming from. I think, like, right now, if we did try to, like, mass engage in those practices, we'd be a little bit, like, shit out of luck in the near future, you know? But yeah, then I guess, like, my question to you is that you're okay with, like, I guess, like, changing our, like, economy, kind of, to the benefit of ourselves, right? And,
Yeah, I meant to say, though, before we move on from this, while we both agree on the NATO calculus, I think it's very easy for somebody to say, I don't give a damn about the Baltic states. I don't care about them. What have they ever done for me? I don't want my city to get nuked over a conflict over them. You know, America first. And while I think that's the wrong way to think about it, I don't think that's, like, an insane or even unreasonable way to think about it. I mean, I think it's wrong, but I understand where you're coming from.
I think it's unreasonable in the sense, right, that you're like, oh, yeah, like, you know, America first, like, I don't care about these other states, and it's like, okay, but are you really going to be saying that? And, like, let's say a dystopian future or whatever, where it's now going to be America against UK,
Super
France,
Russia.
Basically take all the countries in Western European, take the, like, EU plus Russia plus who knows what other countries, you know?
Super Saiyan 5 Russia.
Yeah, like...
powered by the blood of the oppressed in Eastern Europe. Yeah, we don't want that.
Russia
So
rebooted.
I mean, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a much better way to put it. Yeah, I don't. So I mean, I agree with you, but I mean, I think the other position, while wrong, is not based on insanity or malice. I just think it's the wrong answer. You know, I mean, I think it's based on maybe just. I mean, there was a guy by the name of Pat Buchanan who wrote a book saying that basically the biggest mistake America ever made in the 20th century was entering World War II, and. You know, like that, you know, so there are folks who will make that argument. And Pat Buchanan, you can say a lot about him bad, but, I mean, he's not a dumb guy, so. I mean, but anyway, it's, you know, he's, now I don't agree with him. I think he's completely wrong about that position, but, you know. So there are people who make that argument. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, while I disagree with the perspective of Trump voters, you know, I see why some people come to that perspective, you know. But,
so here's the deal.
Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's fine. Like, we're talking, in general. But no, so here's the deal, right? So I look at China, right? And, like, we were talking about these policies the other day, and I was like, I think even though in the short term it might not be ideal, in the long term it certainly would be a hell of a lot of ideal, and even more so, right? If we decide to shake up our trade relationships with China a little bit, right? Yeah. Especially taking into consideration, like, that I think China is just, like, not to put in simplistic terms, but super duper fucking scary, right? They're committing genocide right now. They're vehemently opposed to, like, freedom of speech or, like, criticism. Up to the extent that they'll even try to dictate what U.S. companies do, in the U.S. itself, right, sometimes. So I can't help but wonder, like, why you would be against, if you're even against, like, I guess, like, changing our negotiations with China in general.
Well, the only country I could see any argument against trade relationship with would be China, purely because it's so big and powerful that it's kind of like a Soviet Union, you know, of today. But I would start by saying I'm skeptical of that. But that being said, if you were going to do that, to further the Trump point, the way to do it would definitely be to not do what President Trump has done in any way, which is say he tore up a bunch of existing relationships, and then after tearing up those relationships and alienating our allies, then he picked a trade war with China, one-on-one. Whereas what he could have done was he could have entered into the Trans-Pacific Partnership with all the East Asian countries, and I think some other countries that were in on it, like I think Australia and New Zealand were going to be on it. I'm not 100% on that, but he could have done that, and then all of us together could have confronted China as one, right? So there might have been something there. But even then, I would only be interested in some kind of action insofar as you can make a really clear case of, well, if we engage in temporary tariffs, we can, through some temporary pain, create a long-term benefit. But I think that, like, outside of China, I don't have really any argument for that at all, because if we take that conclusion to its logical end, then do we keep doing business with, I don't know, say Saudi Arabia? I mean, probably not. Saudi Arabia is right up there with China, right?
Yeah.
Do we keep doing business with, I don't know, a country in, you know, like other oppressive countries, like, I don't know, do we do business with a country like, I'm trying to think of a good one here. That is another clear point. Like, say, Pakistan, that's had military dictatorships. Do we cut off, trade with them?
Yeah, so I'm kind of, this is where, like, people are like, oh, you're a low-key, like, imperialist, like, fascist, whatever. Where I do think, like, when it comes to countries that are exerting those types of regimes, that we should try to, like, hurt them a little bit, like, economically.
Yeah. And so, I mean, so how far would you go? Like, would you end trade relations with Israel, for example. I mean, that's a much less clear-cut one, I'd say. But there's
Yeah,
a lot of people would argue for that Israel is another oppressive country, and if you're buying goods that are made in Israel, are you not complicit in that? So
yeah.
would you,
So for
you know,
me, like because Israel's like a great like ground that is so freaking complicated. Yeah, I have like trouble saying like for sure what should happen. Because I do think that they're a valuable ally in the Middle East. I do think that they have done fucked up things. Uh, Especially to like Palestine. I do acknowledge that like the beginnings of Israel and like Palestine's lands like seem to be like many different stories out there, right? Like, oh, well, this was desert land, so like technically, like the Israelites like kind of like fixed it, but then
I don't know about all that.
Yeah,
like I don't know about the background, but I mean, just like as a country that without even going into the specifics, like I guess the question is like, how far would you go in terms of oppression before it's like we don't mind this much for the sake of trade?
Yeah, I guess like for me it's harder to definitely like say for sure in gray ground or where the line is exactly drawn. But I'm like kind of stubborn when it comes to like these things where people are like, oh, but it can be a slippery slope, because I feel like there's like still very clear examples of oppressive regimes, especially when they're oppressing like minorities in their population, right? So like Saudi Arabia, like women can't vote. They were recently allowed to drive. Oh wow, what a great accomplishment. Yeah, China, they're committing genocide like blatantly. So I think like those are like pretty like good examples of, oh no, like they're like basically committing like mass atrocities under people who don't fit like the status quo, and I think that's definitely like a moral line that we as a whole should stand up for. Like imagine if this argument was made, I guess, like in Nazi Germany, right? Like, oh, but they're like a good trade partner. And I know we didn't get into war. Like, let me be clear for everybody in chat as well. The U.S. didn't get into war with Germany because they were committing genocide, right? They got into war because they were an imperialistic threat. But either way, to me, I think like personally, and I think like a lot of people might agree in general as well. Yeah, no, if a country is committing genocide, that's something that we as like a whole should be like, yeah, that's fucked up. Let's not let that happen.
I agree, and I think who doesn't agree is the Chinese Communist Party, because I'm pretty sure that they've hacked your stream because like the camera is like cutting out.
Really? Shit.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Is mine coming in fine for you?
Well, it stopped for a second.
Okay, yeah, I turned it off to see if that would help, but I'm trying to reset the call real quick, okay?
Okay, yeah, go for it. Fuck. Is it better? Is it working?
Yeah, it's all good now. Sorry about that. But
okay.
Yeah, yeah. So,
the government.
No, I don't know if the Chinese communists or the
Russian
FSB is involved.
My internet cuts out randomly, and I've narrowed it down to a list of subjects. Okay, it's either Bezos, the Chinese government, the Russian government, or whoever my internet service provider is. I don't know, one of those.
Alas, it's probably that last one, right? Mine does that too sometimes because we only have one provider here too. So I mean, as far as genocide goes, I think that would be reasonable, but. And like an example of maybe how that would work was in South Africa prior to the end of apartheid, there was increasing action against South Africa for the way their system of government works. And so for human rights violations, like serious and ongoing, I could see something like that. But it's the thing about tariffs and about economic activity like that is it ultimately seems to me like a tariff at the end of the day. I mean, I guess it just depends on what you're doing too, because there are sanctions that some people, want, which would just, end all trade or end most trade. And then there are tariffs. And tariffs, at least on their own, like I know Elizabeth Warren has talked about doing this, she wants tariffs in place for the purpose of maybe not imposing, kind of cajoling other countries into adopting better environmental standards, better labor standards. And it seems like a real frustrating idea to me because, one, you're trying to get other countries to change their policies by, two, taxing Americans in a regressive fashion, since the tariff is basically a consumption tax, and consumption taxes are, like we were talking about the other day, actually, consumption taxes are a regressive tax, right? Even by the definition I put out, where it's a flat tax, a progressive would call it a regressive tax. The same thing in reverse applies with tariffs, because it makes the price of the goods go higher, in proportion to the rate of tariff, which is just another form of consumption tax. So that kind of economic patriotism that I think Elizabeth Warren actually calls it that is, in its own way, kind of unprogressive, since it falls upon, as a share of income, it falls harder on those who are least able to pay.
I guess like the solution to that, right, which is a harder thing to do, which is, kind of difficult, and I think it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, ideal versus practical world. But ideally, I guess the way you would offset that is by putting money into like those businesses that you're taxing. You're basically, like, let's say you're taxing steel or whatever, then put more money into America for steel businesses to like flourish more, and then like have their things cheaper. If that am I making sense? Do I sound crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's definitely something that, like, it has to be, I guess, like, more examined, or, like, what specific industries are we talking about? Does it make sense for, or is it even, like, possible for America to try to, like, offset those losses with local businesses? Like, does that seem like a realistic goal? Because I think, like, maybe we could make an argument for certain industries. I can't have one, like, in the top of my mind. But I don't think for all, like, especially not dying ones in the U.S., or they just want to leave no matter what. But then goes back to my other point, right? For China, like, as much as, like, I hate them and I disagree with them and have literal nightmares about them, I literally had a nightmare the other night where I was, like, in China and I had to, like escape because they were hunting me down because of what I said on Twitch.
Yeah. Or you couldn't get a ticket because you had a bad social credit score.
Yeah. It was like legitimately scary. I think it's because I read that article of the Hong Kong people, like, apparently, like, screaming out their name before they get arrested and saying that they didn't commit suicide. Yeah. But back to the main point, right? Back to something that's not my nightmares. They have policies in place that I think would be very beneficial to place them in America as well. Like, for example, only having, like, businesses that are, like, joint ventures with, like, the American, like, people or populace, right? If you want to, like, sell in America or have, like, a branch here, you gotta be owned partly by Americans,
So again, I know we talked about this a little bit, but for everybody who is who's hearing this for the first time, what is the reason why you would want to do that?
What is the reason why I would want to do that?
Yeah, why do you think it would be a good policy for us to adopt? Because they do that in China for reasons that I think are very different.
Okay.
Or at least are partly very different for the reasons why you want to do it. Like in China, they do, it's not just for jobs. It's also because, they want businesses to toe the party line.
Well, yeah, it's, I guess, like, kind of similar here, not, like, necessarily for party lines, but for more, I guess, like, more general American control, right? Of course, like, maybe, like, you're still going to find people who are, like, fascist in America, right? Or people who might be, like, hardcore tankies even. But I believe, like, generally speaking, especially, like, if companies want to be well run, a lot of those people who fall under said lines tend to be, like, uneducated and don't necessarily have, like, the credentials to fucking run a...
Wait, who fall under what lines?
Who are, like, susceptible to, like, fascism, for example, generally speaking.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm inclined to agree with you, but I mean, not all fascists are...
Oh, not all. Yeah, there's definitely, like, you know, there's two types of fascists, right? The ones that are fascists because they believe they can actually, like, achieve that power and, like, gain control for themselves. And then the fascist that thinks that, oh yeah, the fascist that's going to gain that power is going to help me, even though, like, chances are they won't give a fuck about you.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that Americans would be better at running companies in America than, say, Chinese managers?
Actually, yeah.
I mean, because here you're talking about, okay, so you say, what about better than, say, a European manager?
Even that, yeah.
You say Americans would be better at running a company than a European manager?
In America.
Why so?
Okay, I'm going to use a very strange analogy.
Okay.
So, one thing, or one, like, I guess, like, argument in favor for diversity, right? Or one reason why, like, a lot of companies...
forced diversity?
Yeah, forced diversity.
Okay.
Or, like, one reason why companies, like, even kept, like, these policies in place after they didn't, like, seem, like, mandatory or where, like, the pressure was off on them, is because, in terms of, like, simple marketing, right? Let's say you're a company trying to sell water bottles. I'm so sorry, these are plastic. Yeah. Chat, don't kill me. Okay, so, yeah. Right, so if I want to sell this plastic water bottle, if I'm a company run by only, like, white men, it's going to make sense that the market that I'm going to be able to appeal to most is white men, right? Because that's what my company is run with. Those are the perspectives, or, like, I guess, like, joint, general, growing up, whatever, past experiences that those people have. However, when you start adding women in there, when you start adding, like, black people in there, it changes the dynamic. And it's because people from specific experiences are able to market more towards those who are from the same experiences. Am I making sense?
Well, so what you're saying is, the comparison, if I'm following this correctly, is that this would be basically forced national ownership diversity.
A little
bit. So the Americans have a perspective that is unique to America that is better, or that is at least supplementary to the perspective of...
Yeah, better in the sense that's better suited for America, right? So, for example, like, we can use the opposite example as well. I don't think just, like, a company run by Americans is going to do as well in France as a company owned by American and French people in France, right?
Well, now, I think that is just I think that's ultimately a decision that probably just changes in one situation to another. Like, Americans are probably better at managing... Like, there are different styles of management, right? And I think that while race is a pretty... race in the United States is a pretty... Like, to the extent that you would... I think that it's a different kind of characterization than, say... Well, I don't even think we have to have that argument here. I get the analogy you're making, right? Different perspectives, right? And so the same thing would apply between country to country, right? I was going to say that it was different, but for the purpose of discussing this, it really doesn't even matter. I don't know that the different perspective in this situation is necessarily better, because the American perspective in a particular industry may just be a very poor form of management. Like, for example, American car companies seem to have a very difficult time competing with car companies overseas. And I don't know that that's because the United States, that's for a variety of reasons, but in part it may be because American management styles, American manufacturing techniques with respect to cars just aren't as good. For whatever reason. There could be a bunch of reasons for that. Yeah. I have an example to
you have
consider.
The books.
I read this today. Well, I didn't read the whole book today. But I have a book about this that I looked through today to find some stories here to talk about, to kind of go after things that we talked about before. So this is 2 paragraphs. So I'll be quick as I can. Jeep workers at the sprawling Toledo Assembly Complex in Ohio are quick to voice their economic patriotism. Local efforts to keep Jeep in town are just one expression of a fierce loyalty to American products. Over 90% of the parts needed to produce 50,000 Jeeps in Toledo each month are sourced from communities within 1,500 miles of the plant. But the ownership of the classic car presents a twist in the quest to buy American. Since 2014, Jeep and its parent company Chrysler have been part of the Fiat family. Fiat, I think, it's an Italian car company. After completing its total acquisition of Chrysler, the Italian London-headquartered Fiat Automobiles became the seventh largest automaker in the world. Its Jeep Wranglers topped Cars.com's 2017 American-Made Index, joined by 4 Honda-produced vehicles. 6 out of the 10 most American cars, quote, most American, based on the source of their parts, are made by foreign firms. Large foreign involvement in American auto production is part of the larger foreign direct investment trends. The U.S. receives more FDI than any other country, almost $400 billion in 2016. The U.S. is also the largest source of FDI abroad, sending $300 billion abroad in the same year. And so, this is a company that has managed to build, has managed to do a lot of the things that people, I guess, economic patriots would want it to do, in the sense of local jobs, local production. But this company that bought them and owns them 100% has nevertheless been able to do this better than the American company was.
Yeah, that's why I'm not saying that the companies have to be completely owned by Americans, but I do think that a 50-50 would be a good compromise in that sense. Because even though that you were right in that example that the 100% Italians did so much better than just the Americans, my argument to you would be yeah, there's some exceptions to that rule, but if we're talking about I guess multiple benefits of having the 50-50, I think they far outweigh the rare chances where 100% ownership of a different nation would be better than just 50% ownership, right? Because think about it this way. Let's say the company was owned 50% Americans, 50% Italians. There's no reason to think that, logically speaking, these people could or wouldn't have been able to bring in their ideas or their ways of manufacturing or their exporting, especially taking into consideration that if this branch is opening up here, the other way around, right? We're taking an Italian company that wants to do something in the U.S. They would also be the ones kind of choosing and picking who they want for hire, right? Who do they want their 50% to be? Right. So it probably wouldn't be a scenario where it'd be strong-headed Americans who don't want to think about different perspectives. It'd probably be I'm not going to hire somebody who's going to disagree with me every step of the way. That doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, I don't see really in that scenario, if the Italians don't want Americans to run their company with them, what benefit the Americans can provide, because the Italian investors are only doing this to make money anyway. They're not doing this for some political purpose to infiltrate. Maybe a Chinese company arguably has some angle like that, but for most of the world, the political power imbalance is such that that's not really a consideration. So
I'm kind of confused. Wait.
Angle, well, I'm saying there are two reasons why a foreigner might want to buy an American company. One, if you imagine that the Chinese government is buying an American company for some political purpose, maybe that's a reason. But an Italian, almost anybody else from almost anywhere else in the world, that is not really going to be a calculus. There's no worry about the Italians, exercising political pressure over the United States and corrupting our democracy. That's not really a concern there.
Well, yeah, no,
So I'm saying the only reason they're investing, or most people are investing in the U.S., is because they hope for an economic return, right?
Yeah.
So wouldn't if Americans really can provide something that Italians cannot, will they not on their own accord want to have Americans helping them make decisions?
So theoretically speaking, yes, right? But when you look at I would need to pull up a list, but I feel it's common sense, and I feel I don't want to use the NRA because NRA technically isn't a company.
It might be, I don't know.
Yeah, but where it's been super duper infiltrated by Russian operative, but that's a separate thing.
Well,
the whole point here is that yes, generally speaking, but when you have companies that are coming from China and Russia who only seek to insert themselves in there for not just economic gain, but also to try to have political gain as well.
Yeah.
I feel you could really offset that with having 50% of this company being owned by Americans, which would be to the benefit of the American people as well, just in terms of not losing economic power in those areas or whatever, wherever these companies open up.
So that sounds like, though, you're saying like it sounds like you're making a distinction now, though, that you were making earlier, which is if it's China or Russia, and I agree China and Russia are two unique countries, that's something. But otherwise, then what's the justification for it there if the Americans selling the company or selling it of their own accord, the Italians buying the company, I'm just using the Italians because that's the example I just used, they're buying it of their own accord, they're both only in this exchange to make money. So if the Americans can offer something, why wouldn't they be involved?
No. Yeah, I agree. Like, in an ideal world, where we're just talking strict economics, like, they would do the smart business move and, like, still have like, Americans on board to, like, either in terms of, like, being able to, like, sell their car better there maybe by having those perspectives there, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, because we live in a world where we have, like, political enemies, right, who are more interested...
Right. But purely, like, no Russia, no China here. Just to...
Okay, so this is a problem, right? If we cut out Russia and China, like, are you talking about, like, let's pretend Russia and China never existed? Are you saying...
No, I'm trying... The reason I'm trying to separate them is that I'm trying to see, like, what the economic reason for doing this is.
Well, other than...
about the political reason.
Okay.
Because if you concede that in a perfect world, people who would benefit from having American perspectives would hire Americans to give those perspectives, or if the ownership mattered, they would share the ownership, of their own accord. Like, if you're acknowledging that that's what people should want to do, then apart from some political security reason, why wouldn't they do that? And if they wouldn't do that because it's not in their interest, then why would we want the government to force them to do it?
Okay, so it goes back to ideal versus practical, and to me, like, the answer, like, this again, it's gonna sound weird in a little bit.
That's
yeah.
Right.
The short term, the short answer is whatever. Like, you could have used that same argument when it came to, like, hiring women or minorities, right? Like, doesn't it make sense that if you want to expand these markets or whatever, you would hire those, those that you don't have representative of your company? But, humans in general tend to be, like, biased towards themselves, right? And, like, biased to, like, people who are like them, and biased towards those who share their experiences the most, right? So, yeah, you can say, like, if people were 100%, like, functional little robots or whatever, yeah, they would do the logical thing. However, I feel on it, like, if you want, like, I can try to find specific examples more, because I feel like we're talking a lot in theory. That tends not to really translate well into, like, reality, where you have, like, so much, like, subjectivity and, like, closed-mindedness.
So then you're saying there is a value to making a hiring decision based on nationality rather than on merit?
I would argue that depending on the place you are, nationality can be a merit.
That feels like kind of an America First argument to me. That's like, we got some, like, in my chat, for example, we have some, like, serious, we have some America Firsters who might be memeing. I don't know, but they, they're like, yes, she's an economic nationalist like we are, or, well, like, one guy is saying that, to be fair. One guy is saying that, and he might be memeing, but I like, that's a real parallel. And the reasons you're providing are a little different. That's like a super close parallel. And I'm not saying that to say, therefore, you're wrong. But, I mean, the argument that it is a merit, I mean, that is the same kind of argument that the president makes when he says tariffs are justifiable because we're opening factories up here and the cost... The extra cost is worth it. But
that's the problem is, like, when the president's saying that, like, he doesn't have the data to back it up, right? Like, these extra factories opening up here aren't really opening up here, or, like, you still have a grand influx, like, leaving comparatively, right?
Well, I mean, if we take him at his word on the numbers of, like, he dropped a stat the other day where he said there are 10,000 new factories.
Oh, God. True. I'm 99% sure it's false. Wait, over 10,000 lies already.
10,000, yeah, it's true. He's a man of 10,000 lies. He has, yeah. But suppose, oh my God, Pepper, chill out. Yeah, but the, sorry, this is a,
It's okay. I'm like looking over my comments quickly.
Yeah, no. Chill out with that stuff. But the reason it's interesting is if you take him at his word, then so there has been some growth in like factories, but the part you don't see is the cost of all of those policies. Like, okay, how much investment is not being done because we're paying more for these goods? You know, like how many new companies, how many new jobs are we not creating because we've got we've brought this factory back and the government has basically made an investment decision for everybody instead of letting the market make that decision for itself. Like that's something that even the most well-intentioned kind of government thumb on the scale really can't account for. Like the investment that would have happened had the government not made that choice for everybody, by means of a tariff or an industrial policy.
Yeah,
like the one you're proposing.
I definitely understand where you're coming from, and again, like I'd agree with you if we lived in that like logical world where markets work as they should, which they do most of the time, but there's exceptions, right? And where people were like 100% logical, and where we didn't have political enemies that were out to, I want to say, destroy us. And that sounds like very reactionary, but it's kind of true,
What do you think now? So then that gets to the other side of it, which is the one that I was trying to separate off, which is the political enemy side. So do you think if the Chinese bought a car company, do you think that's like a threat to the United States or really any kind of company? You could if you have an example of a company that is coming to mind that it would be threatening if they owned. It would be a threat to us.
I absolutely think, I can call me crazy, whatever, I absolutely think that any company that the Chinese own in America is a threat, like, period.
So what could they do with, if they own a company? Presumably they've spent money to buy it, and they, are spending money to operate it. And this is money that is coming from somewhere, right? It's not, I'm not accepting the magic money tree premise, and that's not to be rude. I don't mean to be rude here. The modern monetary theory premise that money is a lot easier to print and spend than our current system suggests. So if you imagine that money is coming from somewhere, like what really are they going to do? I mean, apart from, I don't know, like, do you think they'll just shut down the asset, take the loss, and just to mess with us?
Oh, no. They would invest in, like, lobbyists, right, who are, like, trying to, like, pass, like, government policy, who, under the premise of, like, well, you see, we own so-and-so company, and, ideally they want their company to work well, because it'd be a stronger argument, right, for them. Hey, we own Water Bottle Co. And Water Bottle Co. has 1 million Americans that are, like, working for us. And, if you want, like, these Americans who work in Water Bottle Co. to be happy, then you should implement these policies. Oh, and guess what? Some of them happen to be, like, very beneficial for China. But don't worry, because, like, it's also beneficial for you guys, because look at our company who's hiring so many people in Water Bottle Co.
That's, Kirkland is, I'm trying to remember which brand that is. Is that Costco?
I have no idea, honestly.
Kirkland,
I wouldn't be surprised.
I really want to look that up for a separate reason, just for...
I don't know if that'd be so funny if it was...
No, yeah, that's the Costco water bottle. Okay. Okay, so I may have a story about that in a minute. So, okay. So couldn't you, I mean, I can understand that lobbying would be a problem, that, when foreign governments engage in it, but couldn't you just regulate, like, lobbying then? I mean, lobbying's already regulated, and so
look how good it's working out.
Well, with respect to foreign governments, it seems to work out all right. We had that whole investigation into Russian involvement in the American election, and a lot of stuff came out, and I mean, everybody's kind of...
I think China is legitimately, again, like a crazy authoritarian state. So if we really want to take things to extreme and overdrive, I would absolutely not put it underneath the Chinese government to literally try to, like, infiltrate, like, America's market, have, like, hold in a lot of, like, major companies, and threaten to like shut them down, create chaos, like lower production, whatever they have to do. If America's like threatening them in terms of like trade or in government policy, even.
Do you?
And I don't think that's far-fetched. I think like that's yeah.
Well, let me ask you if this changes your opinion on this at all, or at least gives you some pause. So in China, they have capital controls too that they are increasingly ratcheting up, because a lot of Chinese investors are parking their money overseas by buying assets here. Real estate is the most popular one, although I don't believe it's the only one. And I guess presumably you could buy a company, and that would be another way to put your money overseas and keep it from the Chinese government. Now, do you think that the fact that the Chinese government itself is trying to discourage some of this behavior suggests that there's any, like, is it a risk to you if any Chinese investor does it, or is it a risk to you if it's a Chinese state-owned company, I guess?
So,
or is it just like any investor from China is liable to pressure?
I think that it's reasonable to say that almost any Chinese investor from China is susceptible to pressure. And the reason why I say this, and maybe I do have to do more research before I say 100% statement, I'll acknowledge that.
Sure.
Because of China's like unique like cultural circumstances, even if these people are parking out their money because they don't want the Chinese government to get their hands on it, a lot of them still have like intense like Chinese patriotism, right? You can see this most clearly when it comes to Canada and the universities there that have a good percentage of Chinese international students, who still try to exert pressure in those like universities when it comes to like, let's say anybody like Taiwanese representation or shit like that, right? So what I'm trying to get to at here is that like it's kind of like, I guess, a cognitive dissonance, or maybe I'm just generalizing too much, but it seems that even if these people acknowledge that, you know, the Chinese government can get a hold of their money and they don't like that, they also have intense like Chinese patriotism and the whole idea of like, oh no, like China is like kind of like China first, or willing to like exert like the same authoritarian ideals that they grew up with when it comes to American or foreign policy. Did that make sense? Did I clear there?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, that patriotism is a factor too that would motivate a private individual to take action, even if they are not like
directly benefiting.
Yeah. And I guess I don't really accept that premise for the most part.
Okay, then there's another one. I have another one then. So unless if these people are able to like escape China like in the middle of the night or some shit, right? Here's another thing. I also don't put it underneath, or like I don't put it underneath the Chinese government to like literally threaten these people's like direct family or others as like soon as they can. So unless if you're like a complete sociopath and have like, I guess like absolutely no care for your family, I think that would make you susceptible to Chinese government pressure as well. Was that one that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, but like, so suppose they get the pressure, then what like can a company do to hurt the United States other than like I suppose they could repatriate some technology maybe that they bought rights to, but I guess, you know, apart from thinking about examples around the edges that you could say, okay, we're going to limit investment in this very sensitive like national security related business, maybe there's some case for that, but like as a general rule, like what can they do other than tank their own asset and then suffer the hit themselves?
It goes back, it goes back to the idea that, like, if I have economic power in that region, theoretically speaking, part of the economic power is going to be because I have people, I have people working under me, you know? I have voting citizens whose paycheck is reliant on whether I do good or not. And I can absolutely, especially depending on what area I'm in, I can absolutely threaten them and be like, well, you know, the reason why we're thinking of shutting down, or the reason why, you know, your wages are getting cut or whatever, it's because your little senator over there isn't like, your little senator over there is thinking of like putting this policy in place that affects us terribly, you know? So if you want to keep your like little jobs, or if you want to keep your like little wages, then maybe you should like talk to your senator about it. Question mark.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, I guess I just do you have any kind of examples in mind
of most
this has happened?
Specifically, like China exerting political.
An example kind of that brought you down to this. Because, like, for example, I mean, if you like that argument seems like you take that pretty far.
Yeah, no, I'm saying like, in extreme circumstances, which is why I'd rather try to like nip it in the bud before like in this like globalist ever expanding world, like things get more serious. I agree that this is something that would take decades of planning. Okay, like I don't think this is gonna happen like tomorrow. To be clear.
Well, like somebody, libertarian in our chat, just said, this sounds like a great argument to cut the state in the U.S. because people who work for the state vote for more statism. That is to say, people who work for the government support more government jobs. So, do you think people are really, like their voting patterns are tied to?
Well, yeah, but I don't think
employers' interests.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. However, my counter argument to that would be that at least when it comes to like government programs, that, like let's say like welfare or whatever, that helps people on the bottom, having these programs show like long term I guess like I would argue like long term help for that kind of for poverty ridden people, right? That's not a national threat at the same time, right? While Chinese like I guess like full-blown investment can be economically beneficial in the short term, but is a long-term threat to American benefits. So that would be my counter.
Let me let this cat out real quick.
Okay. Okay, so I'm the queen now. I'm taking over. Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I was just telling your chat that you were a scam and I hate you and I'm going to cancel you on Twitter and all that stuff. Yeah, no biggie.
Oh man, canceled on Twitter. That's rough.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
I just started on Twitter.
I'm telling you, if I ever get canceled, I'm like popping a bottle of champagne because I feel like my like opinions are like so like I don't want to say stale because I feel like I've given you hot takes. But at the same time,
yeah, it doesn't feel stale. I'm not trying to do this to be rude.
Go for it.
But I feel like again, those are the arguments that you're making. Again, feel very.
Well, they're patriotistic. They are. They're. I am putting America first in this case.
Let me ask you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I am.
Well, let me ask you then.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry.
No, please. I didn't. Okay. Do you, would you consider yourself a patriotic person?
So this is really complicated because I'm Puerto Rican. So, I'm patriotic towards Puerto Rico, not even specifically towards the United States. But, you know, and you can make the argument like, oh, what helps the U.S. helps Puerto Rico. But that's not necessarily true. Like, if you know, like, I talked to you about the Jones Act before, right?
Yeah. So how do you feel about that? We did kind of half a stream about that one time.
Yeah, it fucking sucks. Hate it, right?
What is... Okay, all right. Why do you dislike the Jones Act? Because I feel like if the Jones Act wasn't something that specifically also affects Puerto Rico pretty hard, and if you didn't have a background there, it's consistent with what you're saying.
Well, here's the thing. Puerto Ricans are technically, like, supposed to be American citizens, right?
Yeah,
we are totally American citizens. So it doesn't make sense to, like, be like, well, you know, if we're leveraging what's, like, best for America here and what helps America, this doesn't really help America because the majority of Puerto Ricans are being fucked over.
Hold on a minute, though. I'm inclined to agree. No, I do agree. Mm-hmm. I think it's a terrible law that should be scrapped. But the justification for it is we want to maintain a merchant marine that we don't need to depend on other countries for, because other countries, if they are the ones providing our intra-American shipping, like, you know, from one American port to another, you know all about this.
Well,
if they're providing it, then they could pull it away.
Yeah.
At any point. Well, and so we need to maintain this higher cost of shipping as the necessary sacrifice to protect our country.
The answer to that is that
someday the Chinese will be doing all this, and then they'll take it away.
The answer to that
they'll vote.
is that it should be amended to not fuck over Hawaii and Puerto Rico, right? Like, holy.
Well, no.
It
hurts them extra.
No,
at the moment.
Yeah, no,
but
it hurts.
I mean, it hurts every American somewhat if shipping costs more than it otherwise would, right?
Yeah, no, but it hurt. How do you call it? And then this is again a thing about like balancing, like what, like I guess what hurt would be bigger, right? Having extra shipping costs or this is complicated in shipping, but yeah, generally speaking, having extra shipping costs or having a country pull away their shipments because of political reasons, you know? But the problem with like the Jones Act specifically in Puerto Rico, right, is that since like Puerto Rico and I don't know why Hawaii is affected like this. They shouldn't be affected for it because I guess probably because they're not mainland U.S. and the Jones Act is like specific to mainland U.S. if I'm not wrong.
I think it's any two American ports, and then maybe the president has the power to declare an exception sometimes. But I'm pretty sure it's any two American ports, and that I'll look it up now just out of curiosity. But
yeah, because when it comes to like Puerto Rico, right? It's kind of fucking weird that PR itself is not considered an American port. No, don't you think? Like,
it's not.
Well, maybe I'm getting confused with the Jones Act and something else. But correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure, this is how the Jones Act works, right? So let's say you have cars in Brazil, right? And then the cars from Brazil, they want to sell it to America. So they have to go to Florida, right?
Yeah.
And then from Florida, right, because of the Jones Act or whatever, they have to change it to, a U.S.-based ship and a U.S., based whatever. And then change... Yeah, now I'm confused.
No, you're right, and they do, I just checked. They do that in Hawaii too. They have to ship it to California, and then they ship it back to Hawaii. And the only reason they do that instead of going Hawaii and then California is just because they can get more bang for their buck by dropping everything off on the mainland and then So I guess in Puerto Rico they do the same thing.
Yeah, they do.
Same argument both ways.
Would it I guess what I'm not understanding here is that. I guess it specifically doesn't make sense for Hawaii and Puerto Rico, or maybe not really Hawaii. Let's talk about Puerto Rico right now because that's where I'm from and I know more about it.
Yeah, sure.
When it comes to Puerto Rico, right? Let's say that there is a scenario where they decide to stop sending shipments to Puerto Rico for whatever reason. You can still technically send out shipments from Florida, right? And that wouldn't be the way it would. That would be. I guess what I'm trying to say is that would be a last resource, right? So worst case scenario, if somebody's if a country's well, if you do not do what we want or whatever, we're gonna stop sending shipments to Puerto Rico, then the answer would just be okay, well, Florida will just cover that, right?
Depending on the good, yeah. We could, or depending on, if you could get it from somewhere else or whatever, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it just sounds like a very, I guess, illogical argument for the benefit, for the benefits of Puerto Rico or whatever, when you obviously have something like that you can do, you know?
Well, I wouldn't dispute for a moment that the Jones Act hurts Puerto Rico, but it also hurts, say, if you're in Los Angeles, that's still a ways away from Seattle, as an example. And so rather than this Chinese ship full of cheap goods being able to stop in San Francisco, Los Angeles, drop everything off for Los Angeles, and then sail north to Seattle to drop the rest of these goods off. And the transportation cost is cheap and it's efficient. It's the same trip, all that.
Okay, I guess I got kind of confused because you had
any two American ports, so it's not just from island to mainland; it's also from mainland to mainland.
Yeah. So the justification for the Jones Act is that it's because just in case a foreign country decides to decide they don't want to send shipments anymore, right?
Well, it would be the point is to maintain American-owned shipping and shipbuilding, and that's the point.
Okay, yeah, no, I at least when it comes to Puerto Rico in general, specifically, that's where you see the worst effects of it, right? because they don't have transcontinental trading. So that's not like a very strong argument. The whole thing about like, oh yeah, it's because like, what if some country wants to use political leverage over us when it comes to shipments? Because at least in mainland United States, you have like planes, you have trucks that is already like very high usage, right? And worst case scenario, like you do set up a shipping company there, right? In Puerto Rico, like that, like because there's no like continental trade or anything like that, because we're a freaking island, all it does is like hurt Puerto Ricans like the third, fourth, fifth fucking level, right? So yeah, I would say overall it does hurt more Americans than it does help out. I would not argue the same for having 50% U.S. ownership.
Well, I agree it's harder to see there, but in that situation, if the only reason you're not doing it is because you are trying to maximize your economic benefit in some way, then then the products you're generating, maybe the Americans, the reason the Italians wouldn't want them is they're just not as efficient. Just, I don't know, just to throw some ideas out. They're not as efficient, or maybe they want higher salaries than the Italian managers do, or whatever, you know? That makes the product cost more than it otherwise would. And that is a cost that's similar to the cost of Jones Act shipping, is spread across everybody who buys the goods. That, in this case, it's whatever's built in that factory, or whatever, whatever is shipped on those ships that have to be U.S. flagged. Like, everybody's paying that cost. You're right that Puerto Rico, because it is, because because it's an island, it costs more, so it's hurt to like the fifth degree. But like, Kentucky is maybe hurt to the second degree. It's not as much. But like, at what point, because again, there's some part of Kentucky that's on the Mississippi River, and if you bring goods into Louisiana, and then
I just think it's
you have to have a U.S. ship bring these goods north. So like, what I'm getting at is, you're right that the harm is not the same across the country with the Jones Act, but it's there everywhere.
So there's a couple of things here, right? I think like just the justification of the Jones Act is like faulty in itself, because there's no way, or in most cases, right? There's no way that a country will be able to like actually use that as like political leverage. If we're just talking shipping, right? I'm not talking about like all companies in general, right? Just because like there's massive like transcontinental trade and whatever, and then worst case, if they do that to like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, then you can bring in an American shipping company, right? Which wouldn't be like too hard to do in theory, because it already happens.
So then should Puerto Rico and Hawaii get like exemptions?
Yeah, for sure.
So then aren't they like now isn't the reverse true, where the mainland is economically, I mean, I'm not saying overall, like, obviously you're right that the U.S. mainland is in a better position to deal with this stuff, but if that's the situation you have, but you keep the Jones Act, isn't Puerto Rico, as a part of the United States of America, getting a benefit at the expense of everybody else? If you abolish the Jones Act just for Puerto Rico, but the rest of the country is...
Oh, no,
if there really is a benefit to U.S. flagged shipping...
Listen, I think I agree with you in general, right, that we should try to do what's best for the majority of Americans, and the specific argument for the Jones Act, I don't think is actually for the benefit of the majority of Americans. It's really only for the benefit for American shipbuilding companies, right? My argument for the whole thing about like having 50% U.S. ownership when it comes to companies in general, I would make that's a much stronger argument for the general the general benefit of the U.S. populace, not just because you have U.S. people making more money, right, in general, across the board, no matter what industry, but also because of the whole like political interference thing that could happen if there is like a low-key, I guess, like U.S. company invasion, whatever. It sounds like so Cold War-ish and crazy, but you understand what I'm trying to say, right?
I like it in a way, because I like that there's a, that among young people in this great country there is a feeling of hey, maybe the Cold War isn't over. I like that. That's I'm teasing a bit, but I guess to kind of bring it home, to bring the story home, this is Mr. Cat, by the way.
He's adorable.
To get to the point of it, that I guess, to kind of put a bow on this subject from my perspective, is that what you've said makes sense with respect to the Jones Act, or with respect to the 50% policy that okay, well, there's some reasons for this, and we know that, hey, this isn't ideal, but there are reasons that are unique to our situation that justify it. And that is the argument behind every tariff, behind every form of economic protectionism. It's always the same argument that, look, we know, ideally, we wouldn't do this, but there's a special circumstance here that comes into play, and that's why we got to do it. And that ultimately results in an economy that is set up to benefit lots of entrenched special interests at the expense of everybody. And I remember reading, for example, in the book here today, that the one example, like the jobs you protect in the process, is these tariffed jobs you're protecting, like the amount to which average Americans are paying extra compared to the amount that we're getting through, say, extra jobs through tariffs. It's like absurd. Like $900,000 are. I really want to see if I can find this figure, but the tariffs as a. Yeah, let me just see if I can find this real quick, because I don't want to say anything absurd. Okay, so a review of 31 case studies found that protectionist measures cost consumers, on average, over $500,000 per job saved. Recent study on tariffs on Chinese tires, and again, I feel like what you're describing would work in practice similar to this. It wouldn't be the same, but it would be similar because, and you would probably grant this, it would raise the cost, probably, if they're not doing this behavior voluntarily. It would probably raise the cost of whatever they're doing if they're not already doing it voluntarily.
Depends on the business, I guess. And the only reason the only reason I say that is
exceptions, but
the only reason I say that is because, like, when if you made the argument that you were making, right, that's like, you know, maybe American managers are, like, more expensive, therefore the cost, like, raises across the board, right? Then I would grant that. However, like, I guess this is something that I would have to, like, read more studies on, because then this sounds weird. What if the American, like, I guess, like, perspective or, like, input or whatever ended up just, like, improving that company even more? And that's something, like, almost impossible to measure, because you would have to have, like, I guess, like, two very similar, if not identical companies, one that had, like, full managers of one and one that had, like, partial managers of another, and see, like, which one fared better, and, like, multiple times. But yeah, no, like, I agree that there are definitely cases where that could totally be the case.
Well, it's worth thinking about, and, you know, I'm open to what you're saying in some narrow circumstances where the government can say, like, maybe, I don't know if this one was legitimate or not, but they said that Huawei phones had some surveillance technology in them, or some kind, that was making it possible for the Chinese Communist Party to, like, suck up data about every American. I don't know if that was true or not, but if that was true, maybe there was some argument to be made that, I don't know. But at the same time, that even that situation seemed to, in practice, just like spyware built in. If that was true, then maybe there was something to that. But even that argument seemed to, in practice, benefit a specific other foreign competitor, Samsung, who, like, I don't know that there was any economic benefit to
well, here's the thing.
It seemed to just benefit another foreign competitor here.
Yeah, like, you know? This is the thing, right? If these branches or if these companies, once they opened up in the U.S., were owned by, like, 50% Americans, then, like, you know, you kind of have a situation where Americans are always winning a little bit, right? So, no, like, think about it.
I mean, some Americans are winning, those Americans who get hired in the ownership process, but to the extent that the goods cost more as a result, to the extent that the company hires fewer Americans because it, for whatever reason, I'm assuming there has to be some reason other than just pig-headedness that they don't want to hire Americans.
Well,
I'm sure sometimes that happens, but, like, or that they don't want Americans to own the company 50%.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, right? Because there's a very big difference between, like, 50% ownership, which means like you need like maybe one American business partner or 10, depending on how many people are like on top level, and between like American workers, right? Because like I imagine that the cost of 50% ownership for an American would be similar for the cost of 50% ownership of another country, right? Like, why would you, if you own half a company, why would you take a smaller piece of the pie? Like, to me, that doesn't make logical sense if you own 50% of it.
Well, I mean, I guess if you own 50% of the company, like if 50% of the shares are owned by Americans, then, for example, it seems like it would make America a much less attractive place to invest in, because,
but that's
like we were saying, that you get that America gets, I think, 300 to 400 billion a year in foreign direct investment now. Like, that number has to go down if you can only have half of the company at this point, because then not only are you, not only are you have less control and less flexibility. I mean, thereby I think making the asset worth less. Not worthless, but just worth less.
Yeah, no. But here's the thing. Like, right now, like, America has, like, one of the strongest economies. Like, even if China's, like, really strong as well, like, a lot of people, if not everybody, still wants a piece of American pie as things stand now. A lot, not all. China has this, like, implicated, and you can argue that, like, oh, well, China's also technically, like, losing, like, foreign investment. But that's not necessarily true, because you still have, like, a shit ton of countries who see, like, okay, like, there's still potential there. It's a huge market. Even 1% is better than no percent, you know? Yeah, so I just don't see, like, how come it can, like, work for China, but for us it would be, like, super disastrous, I guess.
Well, there are, I think, a few reasons.
Are you going to say growing population? Is that what you're going to say?
No.
Okay.
No, China's population... China is... While I share concerns about China, maybe you would feel better to think about this as well. That China is... I'm pretty sure China's going to have a rapid ascent, and then as its population rapidly ages, in part thanks to their one-child policy, they're going to have a rough time toward the second half of the century. Because they're going to have... Like, nobody... They don't have much in the way of immigration. I'm pretty sure they have zero immigration. And so they don't have any, but they still have a slowing population growth, and eventually we'll have negative population growth. Like the United States already, without immigration, has slightly negative population growth. Japan has severely negative population growth. China did just repeal the one-child policy, but like the effects are there. And in some places now they have like a two-child policy anyway, so it's like the same kind of control and all that. I mean, it's less deleterious to the demographics, but so I do think middle of the century they're going to decline in part because of that policy, but like, and the effects of it as it goes on, like that feels like a really big self-inflicted wound. But like there are other things though to be concerned about with China, like in terms of like their overall strength, like the Soviet Union, or not to be concerned about, but to think about. The Soviet Union, during its first 30 to 40 years of existence, also had super good growth rates. Like, they had growth rates, I think, at one point, like 10% a year, 12% a year, really high like China. And eventually, the way their practices for extreme economic growth kind of caught up to them, and their growth rates slowed down and down and down, and eventually the economy went stagnant. And so I don't know that China's temporary success doing some of the authoritarian extra legal things it does, like breakneck development, building like fake cities in the middle of nowhere. Have you seen any of those?
I've heard about them.
At some point, that kind of activity has to catch up to you eventually. And then there are some people who say that the Chinese are kind of faking some of their economic indicators.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Not all of them, but to some degree. Like the CIA used to have Soviet growth figures official, and then the estimated figures, and it wasn't like an extreme exaggeration, but it was still an exaggeration based on just like and of course it was still the CIA.
But I get what you're saying.
It had come out that it had come out later that the Soviets had been fudging the numbers to some degree, not like insanely, but to an appreciable degree. So I guess I would question the premise that what the Chinese are doing is necessarily economically beneficial at all, except maybe to the extent that they are doing this for the sake of getting technology transfers. Maybe then that provides them with a benefit that it would be harder for us to replicate because we have a technology lead in those things. But I think for the most part, the point is to maintain control, like political control over the entity.
But here's the thing.
Rather than to like, I mean, I think that's the real goal. And I'm not sure that that's something that, like, that benefit would have any value in the United States.
Well, yeah, here's the thing, right? And you're right that in China it's done to maintain political control because these companies, when they're 50% owned by Chinese or majority owned by Chinese or whatever, the Chinese government has like their hands around the neck, right? Like, know that these are people that are like under like oath to the Chinese government in general. But, like, that's what, like, in America, I wouldn't say the same thing applies here, right? You can have, like, it's not the Republican, Democratic, whatever party that you're forcing them to hire, unlike China, where it's all under the same party. It's whoever, your company still at the end chooses, like, what Americans you think are most fit to hire, right? Yeah. So I would say, like, that's a big distinction there. You're not completely, like, killing, like, free market at all. You're just saying, like, listen, you want to benefit from America's market, you gotta have 50% like American ownership, right? And I think like saying that, oh no, the cost would be like exponential or whatever, to me that would make more sense if you're saying like, oh no, all the workers have to be 100% American. I could see your argument there. But if it's just the ownership, to me that doesn't make much logical sense, because like, again, why would a 50% owner who's like, I don't know, from France take less than their other 50% owner from Italy? Like, to me that doesn't make much sense.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by why would they take less, because if they own only 50% of the company, then they're only presumably getting, say, 50% of the dividends and whatever.
Profits. It's because when we were like discussing this earlier, you were talking about like, oh, maybe like American like managers or whatever are more expensive to hire than Italian ones. And what I was trying to say is like, oh no,
this is one example.
Yeah, but I was trying to argue that wouldn't be necessarily true when it comes to 50% ownership.
Okay, so, but even then, still, like, you're saying that when they come here, they basically have to find some Americans who they are comfortable with sharing ownership of the company with.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying is, if they haven't already decided to do that on their own, that it seems like kind of what you're advocating is sort of a little pinprick on the finger of the free market here. Just like, you're right, that the free market is not completely killed by the situation, but it's a little prick here and there, one at a time.
It's a little push, you know?
It eventually adds up, though, because this isn't just like, you're not advocating this for like, okay, this is a national security specific industry. You make certain microchips that if they fall in the wrong hands, the Chinese will have their own stealth bomber or something like that. You're saying like this is by default.
Do you believe like all government policy in terms of like economics, like ultimately harms the consumer?
Not all, but probably most. Oh. I mean, if by economic policy you mean saying things like, you have to allow a certain degree of ownership, or you have to have tariffs of a certain amount, or just like controls that are those regulations that are designed to protect jobs, or to keep businesses domestic rather than foreign. I think all of those kinds of rules hurt Americans more than they help.
Okay, so I think, at least when it comes to like joint, okay, here's another thing, right? So with the exception of maybe like the Italian cars that you were talking about, maybe that's not an exception. Maybe that's even the rule. I would honestly have to research more. If you found like studies or whatever that did talk about how like these like diversities do increase profits in the long run, would you be willing to like perhaps concede or think about it more that this policy in general is even better for said companies?
Yeah, to the extent you're saying, would you be willing to concede that this policy
or
could be better
or
for them?
consider, you could consider it. You
Would
don't
you
have
be
to
willing to consider it? That it would maybe give them more money or be better in that sense?
Yeah.
Maybe. But even then, I would still be against it, because it is still saying, okay, this is it's still a restriction on what this company can do without, I think, a reasonable public interest on it. It's just like, it seems to me to be at baseline an infringement on freedom.
Okay.
That doesn't seem to have any kind of exigency to justify it. So even if you could say that, yeah, everybody is affected by this, but hey, they also all benefit from it, I would still be like, well, even if that's true,
so
you
I
should
guess
still be able to make the decision otherwise if you want.
so.
Unless there's some exigency, like, the self-bomber example I gave you.
Yeah, so I guess this is something we agree to disagree on, because at least for your thing about China, like I do view them as a very like apparent threat that I would undoubtedly think that they'd be willing to, like, kind of try to like nuke or harm our economy the second that we try to do anything to challenge their authority. But you don't think we're like in that state yet, or do you think that they wouldn't go through, like, I guess, like those loops of like creating like or investing businesses in America that are Chinese owned to have control of, I guess, certain political areas or etc.
Yeah, I'm really not worried about that. I mean, there might be some exceptions, like, say, maybe if a Chinese company owned the power grid, then the power grid, you really could flip a switch and shut off a military base or something. That might be one exception. So, like, your local utility that owns the power grid, if they decided, we want to sell to China, that might be different. Because that really is a clear example of where, okay, we can imagine very clearly, if they want to shut down the grid, and if they, in this situation, really do have the ability to do that, maybe that's an issue. But otherwise, I don't, the harm is that I guess they could render people, they could put people out of work by closing their business and losing their money. But there's not any, like, military justification for it. I mean, and even in the power grid situation, if they don't have the power to, like, shut it off in the situation I've described, then it still doesn't seem like it's a problem, as long as, like, ownership itself doesn't seem like a problem. Like, it only seems like it'd never be a problem if there was a real provable, like, national security risk.
Because I think, like, I think that, like, that soft power of threatening American jobs and, like, threatening, I guess, like, American stability in those regions is, it is, like, a threat when it comes to at least, like, influencing members of Congress to, like, pass certain policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess, like, ironically, and this is I think the most far-fetched argument I'm gonna make yet, but I still want to make it because it's fun.
Go for it.
I guess, like, ironically, I also view this as, I guess, a long-term prevention of authoritarianism, because if you do have Chinese companies, like, threatening this shit, and, like, maybe you don't even close them, maybe it's just, like, a pure threat, but it's still a really fucking scary one. Then to me, and depending on the areas they are in, because, like, let's say, especially with how America is, where you have these pseudo-monopolies around, where technically, even though across the nation they don't have complete control, like, there's certain areas where they do, the only way I could see to, like, properly combat that is to, like, literally just, like, sack the people running it and replace them. And to me, that is authoritarian to, like, the max, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is a risk that just seems pretty remote, though, to justify this whole policy on. I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, well, we want to do this so that somewhere down the line, if we really need this business, we don't have to just take it over nationally, right?
Mm-hmm. That's why I said this one's, like, the most, like, decades. I get
that. But then again, if you had a policy that said, all right, look, if things really do hit the fan, and we need to take over a Chinese-owned company, I mean, already I guess the federal government probably has that kind of a power in some kind of emergency, and I don't know the contours of that, but I imagine that the federal government already reserves a lot of power to tinker with the economy in a time of war.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think that is enough of a direct threat to say, all right, as a result, every business, no matter who owns it, needs that 50% ownership, So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Well,
but
this was fun though.
it was fun, and I think that it was really interesting because I guess I'm still like I am I am I am kind of surprised by the degree to which I often am at odds with people, on different, on I guess I just don't I'm surprised that there's so much skepticism about like what the individual person would do. It sounds like really at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Like how do you feel about just maybe as one final thought, because it sounds like you kind of ready to wind it down. Well, I mean, if not though, that's fine by me. I'm having a good time.
Yeah, no, I'm having a good time as well. I guess it just depends on the subjects. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just shoot.
Okay, so how do you feel? Do you feel that, let's say that somebody was receiving $500 in food stamps and $500 of, family assistance money,
mm-hmm.
And there was a choice of. Say, okay, you could get $1,000 a month cash, no strings attached, or, the federal government will guarantee you $500 in food and $500 in medical assistance, and
Mm-hmm.
like in essence,
like choose one.
Do you think what's that? Yeah, do you think it would be better for the government to just give you the $1,000, or would it be better to say no, we know how you need to spend it. Clearly you're poor, so you really don't know how to spend it.
Is this about the freedom dividend, kind of?
This is kind of, although I simplified the numbers just for the sake of
Yeah, okay. No, I would say that at least, like, especially poor people, I do mm-hmm. think that they kind of know when it comes to those specifics of money. Mm-hmm. If they have like 1,000, no strings attached, yeah, I think that they would spend it like where they need to spend it, because at least from what I've read so far, like those studies do show that poor people who get like extra income don't do it on frivolous things, right? It's not like they're gonna buy a new pair of like Nike sneakers. They actually do spend it on either repaying debt, food, things like that. So yeah, no, I think it makes sense.
So I agree with you basically. That I think either one, they're not going to spend it on, to use your example, like new sneakers, unless for whatever reason those new sneakers really are to them like really more beneficial than the alternative, right? Mm-hmm. Of spending on something else. So if that's the case though, why wouldn't you extend the same kind of courtesy to some kind of big investor,
Honestly,
I mean, who presumably is at least as sophisticated about what their own best interests are, right?
This is going to sound like so snobby or rude or mean or whatever. I think people who have like kind of that much money or so much money to be able to like invest in said businesses often are out of touch of like, I guess like, I don't say reality, but of like how do you call it? Short-term needs, right? And maybe like this is even every human, I'd argue. A lot of us, when it comes to like short-term needs or like short-term thoughts, we're a lot. Let me put it this way. I guess like we're a lot more. Words are hard. So let's say you're a person. Yeah, let's say you're a poor person, right? And this is like a matter of like being able to like live or die, kind of, right? Being able to get your money in order. For like those short-term things, like it becomes like a lot more apparent and clear because you're doing this as a means of like survival, right? And not just like you could make the same argument for the rich investor, but the truth is like chances are you're not putting 100% of your life earnings into this company. Like that's super rare. If you're doing like such a big investment of going overseas, etc., etc., etc. So to me, my argument would be like there's a separation of degree there between like where your money's going to go and how your business is going to end up functioning and what's ideal or not, and a person who is literally like advocating or like budgeting their money to survive. And the reason why I say that is like it goes back to like at least the data I've read and gathered and like studied, right? So like from what I've read, and I might be wrong, you can like send me links that are wrong. You're like if ideally everybody worked that way, that they could see like long-term things and move past their biases, which I guess is the biggest thing here, yeah, you'd be like totally right. They would totally be like, oh no, like my best interest is to hire like women or minorities or whatever, because like more diversity equals better selling of my product. However, reality doesn't really translate that well. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's very different when it comes to trying to know whether I should spend my money on like food or new pairs of clothes, like sneakers or whatever that cost $1 million, right? And who do I think is gonna do the best for my job, right? And a lot of times people who think, oh, the people who are going to do the best for my job are people like me. Because people like me, you know, I think I'm a cool person. I think I've been pretty successful. So I'm going to hire those that are like me. And you see this in big boards too, right? That's why the UK is thinking about, or I think they've already passed like a forced diversity law, in the sense that like in terms of like boards of big businesses, at least 33% have to be women. Because that's just like kind of how the human psyche and mind works. That when it comes to like hiring other individuals, we tend to like want to hire those that reflect ourselves a little bit, because we're kind of biased towards ourselves. We kind of think that like if we've done good, and we think people like us will continue to do good. So it's harder for us to like kind of break down that barrier or hire people who are like different than us in that sense. So to me, like, I guess that's the biggest distinction.
Well, I think that while I get what you're saying there, it seems like to me you're saying that some individuals can be trusted, other individuals cannot, to do what is in basically their own best interest.
What I'm trying to say is that a person will try to do what's in their best interest all the time, right? Right. However, oftentimes what a person might think is in their best interest really isn't. And I know that sounds really authoritarian.
But doesn't that go?
I know.
Not even. That's at worst paternalistic, although arguably authoritarian. But if you think that, then why would you say, well, this person though with no money, we totally.
This literally.
I mean, because historically, that's the first thing people say when I mention $1,000 of free money a month is, hey, you know what? They know what they're going to do with that money. They're going to drink it. They're going to waste it because they don't know their long-term interest.
So
really, they've been in poverty so long.
Yeah, no.
They're disconnected from us middle-class people who know how to spend our money right.
No, this is something that I literally just go back and rely on data on, right? And so far, everything I've read about the freedom dividend and things like that, or programs similar to that, is that when poor people are given those money, they don't spend it on drinking and drugs. No, they spend it on what they need to do. Now, if there was data saying otherwise, if I read like countless studies that proved otherwise, that no, when poor people get money, they spend it on drugs and alcohol, and they don't actually spend it on their needs, then yeah, I would re-examine my position on that. I'd be like, you know what, like, if that's not on their fault of their own, that's just like a lack of education, I guess.
And I agree with you on that position. The only thing I'm saying, I agree that poor people totally are as capable of spending the money that they get as anybody else. So what I don't get is why then I don't get why you wouldn't extend the same ultimate courtesy of individual liberty. We trust that you will do whatever is best with the resources you've got.
Well, because that it goes back.
And I'm not saying. I'm just saying like. Why you're saying that they're like more disconnected from what is ultimately their best interest here?
Well, it goes back to like what I've read and studied, right? And what I've read and studied so far, at least when it comes to hiring practices and things like that, is that people often do have like biases when it comes to hiring that aren't really logical. So,
if that's the case, then would you feel suppose that maybe most of the time they make the right decision, but sometimes they are off, right? Sometimes they make the biased hiring decision, right? Even though it hurts their interest, sometimes they make the wrong decision. Would you feel like if that happened 50% of the time, that is enough reason to say, all right, we're going to make the decision for everybody? Like if 50% of the time people get it wrong, is that often enough to say, we're going to scrap your, we're just going to make this decision for you?
That's really hard for me to answer. I'd have to think more about it, because to me at that point it would be like kind of flipping a coin a little bit.
Well, I guess the reason I ask is, that with the universal basic income as a form of social assistance, I would be interested in it, even if somebody could say, yeah, we know a lot of people, though, they're just going to waste it. You know, I don't know if 50%, you know, but yeah, 50% of people, they're going to waste it. They're not going to spend on what they should. I would still be interested in it, because what matters is that we're giving people the freedom to make decisions for themselves, and they can either do well on their own with that freedom, or they can, you know, crash out. But I mean, either way, we've given them the tools and the power to improve their own lives, right? To me, then, the results matter comparatively less, because I mean, the point is, if we want to help people, we want to give them the opportunity to help them, and we want to help them, we want them to have the opportunity to improve themselves. We've given that, right? And we've given them the freedom to do so in the way that benefits them best, right? So I guess I feel like you don't really place any value on just the individual autonomy side of it here, it sounds like. You're just literally data driven. I will do the best thing.
I'm a little bit data driven. But okay. I guess to me, what I would argue is the biggest difference between both those examples is, hey, I'd agree with you in a freedom dividend, even if it's like 50%, it's still worth trying out. Yeah. But it's because in these cases, you know, potentially have people literally getting out of poverty with that, you know? Or, you know, maybe not completely solving the problem of poverty, but really getting far ahead. But then the whole thing, the whole like cost benefit analysis would be like, oh, perhaps some less foreign investment, which in that case I would be like I'm not 100% sure like how much like less foreign investment would happen to say like, oh no, this isn't like worth it, I guess.
You're right. That's like the seen and unseen problem, though, again, where it's like, okay, less foreign investment. Okay, well, that is one on its face, a kind of an intangible concept. Like, what even is foreign investment? Like, we know what it is textually, but we can't, like, when you visualize it, what do you invest? What do you visualize in, really? You know, it's harder to visualize tangibly. And as one example, less foreign investment would mean less creation of new jobs in the United States, because a lot of that foreign investment would be used to hire employees to work at these businesses that are, for the moment, although maybe someday, are owned by, you know, a foreign company. Like, so that's less money used to hire Americans. In essence, it's the same thing you just described with UBI, except in reverse. Instead of money used to raise people out of poverty, it's a job that helps raise somebody out of poverty.
I'm a little bit confused.
It's not created.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. So you're saying, I guess this is something that's like, again, I think it just goes back to agreeing to disagree. Because in my mind, if a company is 50% owned by Americans, right, then you have like the additional effect of if the company wants to like get up and leave or whatever, there might be less incentive to do so if half of them are Americans, right?
Right.
Or, so, like, you can argue, like, hey, you're even saving jobs in that aspect. Or you can make the argument that when it comes to, like, 50% ownership, hey, like, if deals fall through or whatever, then those Americans that benefited for a while with that 50% ownership can then just reinvest to other jobs in the market in the U.S. While, like, let's say a person who owned a Chinese-owned company in the United States might just, like, bring back whatever extra cash or moolah they made back to China, you know? So, like, these things about, like, less jobs, you can easily make the argument that you could create more jobs with the whole 50% thing.
Well, that's the other thing. You see the jobs that you preserve by saying that 50% have to be owners, but you don't see the jobs that you lose by virtue of less foreign direct investment because the U.S. is a less attractive place to invest in. You don't see the jobs that you lose because, because you have fewer companies wanting to do business here because it's harder to then, right? If things go south, pick up and leave. You miss out on all of that, and so it sounds good and maybe even looks good on in terms of its actual effect, but you're missing out on all the more efficient economic activity you'd have instead. So instead, you just point to, well, we created 10 jobs, instead of saying, well, but with the money with the efficiency we lost, we could have created 20, 50, 100, whatever.
Well, here's the thing, right? Like, I would agree with you if we were a small country like Latvia and Estonia or whatever, right? And maybe you're right that in the sense, like, oh, but these policies that the China's doing is going to catch up to them in, like, 50 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But then again, like, if China is caught up in 50 years or whatever, the policies are going to be far beyond just this one, you know? It's going to be like the one-child policy. It's going to be a shit ton of other things. But to say the same thing about the United States, I feel like is an unfair comparison. Because we are, like, the largest, if not, like, the second largest, I don't know where China is right now, honestly. I don't know if they're first or second, or if we're, like, basically the same. Market in the world, right? We're the largest consumer market, or if not the second one. We literally buy more than any other country, and we have, like, with a 311 million population, right? Like, we are, like, we're freaking huge. Like, if you don't want a slice of, like, American pie, I
like the reference to American Pie here.
Yeah. If you're a company that wants to make more money, then yeah, it makes sense that you should want to put your foot inside the American door, right? Otherwise, like, think about it this way. Like, even if you I'm trying to think about, like, a good analogy or whatever, but I guess I'll use the opposite way for China, right? Yeah. These huge, massive corporations that are already making millions upon millions upon millions that are, like, American, right? Like, how much more money do you even need? Are still desperate to get into China because they know of the potential there. So when you have all these businesses that are already making a good amount of moolah, and you're like, hey, you know, if you want to keep making those giant rakes of cash, make sure, like, half your board is, like, 50 Americans or whatever, or you're outsy. I strongly doubt they're going to be like, okay, we're outsy.
Well, you know, maybe with that one first little prick, it's like, okay, maybe, you know, it's still worth doing it. You know, with that